So again, this was going to be all about a debrief of the legislative session in 2026 at the Minnesota Legislature. So we're going to do, we've done our introductions. We're going to start off by talking again about what kind of political landscape that this legislative session happened in. So we're going to give a timeline of Operation Metro Surge, and just give a layout of how the events played out, what the kind of the escalation looked like, and what the outcomes of those situations were. We're going to talk about how ACLU works in these kind of situations. We're going to talk about integrated advocacy, which is the way our departments work together, and the results of that, teamwork at the org level. And then we're going to talk about our responses to Operation Metro Surge, both organizing and legal. And then, of course, we'll get into the policy response, which is what happened at the legislative session. The ACLU is usually down at the legislative session at the Capitol every year from January to May. So we do full-time lobbying, and we also just work to change laws in a way that, kind of coincides with ACLU's mission and values, and is in line with organizing and legal teams work. And then we'll end with a Q&A discussion that will take up most of the time. So this presentation will be brief, but hopefully a good summary of what's happened. Before we get into the policies of the legislative session and what's occurred, and talking about bills and policy solutions, we have to understand the context of this session, and talk about just the historic events that have gone down in Minnesota since last fall. We've seen a historic federal surge and one of the largest immigration enforcement operations in this country's history in the last few months. And the 2026 legislative session is defined by these events in large part. And we'll talk about, how lawmakers individually and as a group responded to those events. And really, we're going to talk about what happened when Minnesota is in the crosshairs of the Trump administration, and how ACLU sees these moments and how ACLU plans for these moments and what kind of policy solutions we give and kind of actions that we take. So we're going to talk a lot about the federal surge. John, do you want to get into the timeline and kind of start talking about the events and where we began?
Yes, thanks, Mira. So generally the way we work here at the ACLU Minnesota, focused around, and our policy work focused around the Minnesota legislative session is focused on the biennium. So that's a 2-year period where the Minnesota legislature meets. Bills that begin in 1 year, so the odd year, like 2025, roll over into 2026, 2025, 2027, 2029. The odd years are all budget years, and they generally refer to the even years, the back end of the biennium, as a policy year. So we had a policy agenda for 2025 that we worked on at the Capitol, and we're refining it and planning on going into 2026, trying to get some of those pieces across the finish line. In the fall and then the winter of 2025, that pretty dramatically changed with the implementation on the federal level of Operation Metro Surge. And so that begins in November of last year with allegations of fraud against Somali daycares in the Twin Cities. This is in part right-wing YouTubers trying to stir up allegations that have not been substantiated. And that moves into a revocation of temporary protected status by the federal government in late November. And in early December, there's an initial surge of a few hundred agents. We see then later in December, I guess still early, we get about 3,000 federal agents deployed to the Twin Cities and to the metro area. That's called, the acting director then, Todd Lyons, calls it the largest immigration operation ever. The ACLU legal team springs into action. We file our first lawsuit protecting the rights of First Amendment observers and First Amendment demonstrators. And this is the Tincher v. Nome case. And then in January is when we escalate into the several thousand agents, which has the impact of the killings of Renee Good, and then a week later the killings of Alex Preddy. Those are kind of the violent physical peaks of the surge but we do see, hundreds and thousands of Minnesotans around the state wrongfully detained, wrongfully harassed, and a lot of times, you know, violently detained, kept in squalid conditions in the Whipple building, denied access to counsel, denied access to religious guidance, and denied basic constitutional rights, all for either demonstrating, observing, recording, exercising their First Amendment rights, or for simply being brown and black and being profiled in the cities, which are described in more detail in our lawsuits, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And so, what that does for us at the Capitol is it really pivots to responding to Metro Surge. So, immigration and immigration response at a state level becomes a much broader and larger portion of our agenda, as both we at the ACLU and the state legislature looks for ways to protect the state against this federal onslaught.
So John, you can go ahead and continue, but this is kind of a summary of the lessons that ACLU has taken from the surge, and how we've kind of transformed our thinking and our work. So we kind of just listed out that first, this kind of historic rise in immigration enforcement began with was something that I think maybe people have forgotten at this point, which was the allegations linking Somali Americans to terrorism, which is kind of this kind of scapegoating and targeting of a certain immigrant population, largely through media, social media, things like that. So it started off quite small and snowballed into a historic operation. There's also the targeting of Trump and the playing politics, especially with blue states, and especially, the kind of animosity towards Governor Walz. But certainly, the Trump administration had a large part to do with that. With the way they behaved with blue states. And then the fact that ICE and Border Patrol have acted as a secret police, the kind of fact that they're masked, they have guns, you can't quite tell if they're law enforcement or not, was a huge theme of the surge. This idea that you could just be, your home could be barged into, that you could be brutalized in a protest, and that there's really no recourse after that, is a growing issue. And then, of course, just authoritarianism in general and the rise of it. We've seen violent raids, illegal imprisonment and detention, violation of, several constitutional rights. And then something we'll talk about later is the rise in surveillance state, and surveillance infrastructure, and how ICE and Border Patrol use surveillance technology to violate constitutional rights. But John, do you want to add more on the lessons from the surge?
Did a good job covering it there. A lot of what we were invited to discuss then at the Capitol was this growing increase in violations of constitutional rights. Just through December through February, when we were invited up there to speak, both in the Senate and the State Senate and the State House. We documented that we had seen violations of the First, Second, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and 10th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which is 60% of the Bill of Rights, and even that does kind of undersells exactly how broad those violations were. We received and have received, I believe, over 1,000 reports in our portal of alleging various constitutional violations, and we really like to talk about that as kind of the output of the funnel, because that's just capturing a small amount for individuals for those reports to be documented and to be provided to us. That requires the constitutional violation to occur. It requires somebody to know that our portal exists, to have documentation of it. If somebody gets stopped and abducted on the side of the road, and there's nobody there to record it, the ACLU doesn't necessarily receive notice of that constitutional violation. So while we did receive over 1,000 reports of constitutional violations during Metro Surge, we believe that's a serious undercount of those that occurred around the state. What we highlighted there was a lot of the lawlessness too, not just the unconstitutionality of what ICE and CBP were doing, but even in the courts saw a significant increase in violations of court orders. The chief judge of the District of Minnesota, a federal judge, noted that ICE had violated in 1 month nearly 100 orders. I think when he was asked to go back and revise that issue, He got that to about 200 in 2 months, which he said was likely more court orders violated in 1 month than most federal agencies had violated in their entire existence. So what we saw was not just the lawlessness and disregard for the Constitution, but a total disregard for the separation of powers and the independent judiciary.
Mhm. So we want to talk about, how does ACLU respond in these moments? We've kind of outlined the timeline of Operation Metro Surge, how it escalated from fall, and really kind of the, incoming of a second Trump administration. How does ACLU act in these moments and respond? And the thing is that although we do lawsuits and we do have a strong legal department, we also have organizing and lobbying, as do other ACLU affiliates across the country, are really starting to have this multi-pronged approach. So we're going to talk about more than just like the bills that we gave or the lawsuits, but really how all of these work together. So we're going to talk about some things that happened early in the surge with legal and organizing. We're going to talk about lawsuits around Tincher as well as Hussein. Talk about the work of organizing as well. How do organizers help the attorneys finding declarants and constitutional observers, and just seeing how that process works. And Julio will kind of talk about organizing and community engagement, and what that work looked like to support legal and the ACLU org in general.
Yeah, for sure. Good evening, everybody. Again, my name is Julio. Him. And Manera and John, as y'all go through some of the events that happened in this winter, I think folks know all too well of the response that the Minnesotans have had during this fall, and it was immense. It's been a teaching moment for a nation, and it's go down. It will be historic in the way that we respond to this surge of federal overreach. Um, that all said, for folks who have been doing this, folks who are involved with this, they know that this kind of push and resistance started a long time ago. In fact, one of the things that we were working on in 2024 was preparing for what would be a Trump administration. So in the summer of 2024, the ACLU with other across the country got together to prepare what we call the firewall, which it would be a set of recommendations, policies, actions that we could take as a state to prevent the type of federal overreach we would see. I'd like to sit here and say that we saw the scale of Metro Surge that we saw that coming, but it was, I think what we expected was an incredible amount of immigration enforcement, maybe not to the scale. But one thing we were able to prepare for was more immigration enforcement, preparing ourselves, and more importantly, preparing our neighbors through rights presentations. We also knew that internally we had to get ready. We had to be prepared with not just a policy agenda, but also getting together our organizations, getting together our like I said, our neighbors, getting together the type of response that we would need. For that reason, we'd reached out to organizations like Opal, Minnesota 8, ICOM, the Immigrant Law Center, the Advocates, all organizations that we were asking the question, what are we going to do together? Out of that came something that y'all probably heard of as the Immigrant Defense Network, which has been pivotal in being able to respond to this. As to date, the network has trained over 30,000 people, 30,000 Minnesotans to respond to Metro Surge. So when we saw those escalated incidents with ICE, those arrests, those same people that were trained were responding. Many of you may have been part of that. In fact, probably maybe the reason you're here today. And that was one of the responses. At the same time, we had folks like Manera, folks like John, who knew we had to respond at the legislature, who knew we needed a policy to put forward an answer so that this not happen again. And so now you see this legislative process happening. Within all of that, we see the shootings, the gas mask, the gas, the tear gas on our communities, our neighborhoods. Those are things we were responding to, right, in that moment. And out of that came an intake system in which we were asking communities to come forward with their complaints. As you heard, our legal team was busy having over 500 intakes during that time, and those were able to become those lawsuits that you've heard about today. But it wasn't without the help of our neighbors, the help of our organizations, our partners, that we were able to collect those through hotlines, through conversations, through chats. That was the kind of work that I think we had to establish years before, and it's I think one of the reasons why Minnesota was able to respond at the time that it was able to respond. Um, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Julio. And especially highlighting the kind of organizations that work together to form IDN, the Immigration Defense Network, I think was just a highlight of MetroSurge and how people
It
organize.
really was.
So we're going to go into the lawsuits now and talk about, what did legal department do? What are these lawsuits about? How do they work with Operation MetroSurge? And what does it mean for us going forward? John, go ahead.
Thanks, Mayor. So yeah, we had two major lawsuits stemming from DHS conduct during Metro Surge. The first is Tincher v. Nome, which is filed in December, and that is a First Amendment case, are alleging First Amendment violations. We end up having over 140 or nearly 140 sworn affidavits filed in support. And so these are individuals who came forward and told their story under oath or in sworn declarations under penalty of perjury of what happened to them. And there's a lot of documentation, both video, photographic evidence supporting that. And the initial outcome is a win at the district court level. They issue judgment as issues an injunction prohibiting conduct that the DHS has been doing during Metro Surge, harassing and detaining those lawful observers. The Eighth Circuit eventually reverses that injunction. And then we have Hussein v. Nome, where we have 23 declarants and plaintiffs alleging claims of racial profiling, warrantless detention against DHS. Now, the court finds that each of these stops was racially motivated and unconstitutional. However, the court does decline to impose a preliminary injunction in this case. The standard for preliminary injunctions is rather high, and what the court had trouble with was determining whether or not these individuals themselves would be subject to further racial profiling. At this point, by the time we get that ruling, Operation Metro Surge is allegedly winding down. The decision is made not to appeal that to the Eighth Circuit and just continue pursuing that outcome. And so there's a few reasons our legal team would cite for that. A lot of it is just the difficulty in getting a preliminary injunction. The standard is quite high to ask the court to restrain the federal government from certain conduct. And that the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals is not necessarily the most friendly place for these types of claims. But what the courts do confirm for us, and the way some of our attorneys like to talk about them, is that these are the most validating losses that you can suffer, and that they find that the facts of the underlying cases really bear witness and really bear out as to what our plaintiffs and what our declarants suffered, that there was First Amendment retaliation, that protesters and observers and documenters who were exercising their First Amendment rights were brutalized and were wrongfully detained, and that they were threatened, again, in violation of that First Amendment right, because a threat to retaliate against someone is similar to retaliation itself, and that it chills that protected First Amendment speech. And then in the Hussein case, that those individuals were racially profiled, that the government did not have reasonable basis or probable cause to make those stops, make those detentions. That the only thing they were doing is they were profiling people based on their skin color, based on accents, based on religious garb, other means of identifying individuals and singling them out as people that DHS wanted to harass and wanted to detain.
Thanks, Ron. So as we have those legal cases playing out early 2026, the legislative session begins in February and ends in May. So it's a really relatively short session because it's the second half of the biennium. But because of Operation Metro Surge, we have to pivot and we have a totally new legislative agenda. And lawmakers are also scrambling to have new responses. So the ACLU team has their own own kind of policy packages. And our legislative agenda falls into two buckets. One is what we call the No Secret Police package, which is all to do with Operation Metro Surge, and talking about like immigration enforcement and how that interplays with the state laws, and what can state lawmakers do about that. So those are the immigration bills that are packaged together. And then there's also surveillance bills. So the process of, introducing these, getting people on board, talking about the issues, explaining the issues was kind of the work of that early few months in session. So again, this is the ACLU legislative agenda. This is a legislative agenda is just what are your priorities going into this session? What bills are you going to drop? What things do you essentially hope to put into law, and enact as reforms? So again, we have immigration being the kind of top of our ticket because of Operation Metro Surge, and we have the No Secret Police Policy package. So we are saying package, but these bills kind of moved very, kind of separately together in the beginning. So there'll be individual bills, and later they were packaged together by the Senate. So they include things like protected spaces, mask ban, 1983 cause of action, 287G bans, and other stuff. John will go through this in a little bit and talk about what are these policies and what kind of issues in immigration enforcement are they getting at. The second piece of our agenda is all to do with surveillance. So this is something that's kind of a niche and a kind of a place of expertise for the ACLU Minnesota, and often we're the only ones in the room talking about surveillance and data privacy. So our surveillance agenda is to do with the license plate readers, and kind of legislative fix around that. We also have a prohibition on reverse warrants, and facial recognition. So we'll go through later these kind of individual policies, especially the surveillance ones. And then we have our supporting priorities. These are coalition-based issues. So they're not ACLU-led, but they're other issues that, ACLU weighs in on and supports at a coalition level. So those are listed below. So we'll jump into John talking us through the immigration policies and what they mean.
Sure. Thanks, Pinera. And what we have here are the bills that we'll get into, like the success or successes of the legislative session. But these are the bills that ultimately made it closest to the finish line. Every bill on this page passed off the Senate floor on a party line vote, and then received a vote in the House, with every DFL member voting in support and every GOP member opposing. And so it did die, but these are the bills that made it the furthest, the bills that we think have the greatest chance of success in next year. And so what we packaged together were these protected spaces bills. So these require judicial warrants for immigration arrests. They don't discriminate against which officers would be making the arrest, local, state, county, or federal agents. They'd all require a warrant to enter certain types of property. So those would be childcare centers, public schools, post-secondary institutions, healthcare facilities, and courthouses. The courts in other areas that have been asked to consider these, primarily the Ninth Circuit, have found that these are constitutional policies when they're applied broadly to all law enforcement. And there is some nexus of public relationship to the building that you're prohibiting that warrantless entry to. So where California did this, they could not apply it to all private businesses. They can't tell private businesses, they can't tell religious entities who they can and can't allow onto their property, but they can tell their state courthouses that you're not allowed to grant permission. They can tell public schools, public universities, things like that, everybody that gets state funding, that they can't enter without a warrant, or you can't give permission to enter. The next piece was they right to a public education. This is a codification of Plyler v. Doe. It says this is a 1970s case that says you cannot discriminate in public education on the basis of immigration status or on the immigration status of their parents. It's a landmark ruling. There were a lot of states, mostly border states, that did start to discriminate and prohibit immigrant access to education. Minnesota did not have a law one way or the other, so it was kind of a mishmash of how school districts wanted to interpret it. Most did, but we don't want to leave that up to chance. I like to say to people that the right to access public education for immigrant children is as safe today as Roe v. Wade was last decade, meaning that as soon as the Supreme Court decides to revisit it, they could revoke that right. And it's something that conservative legal groups, the Heritage Foundation among them, is actively pushing red states down in the Deep South to begin contesting. They believe that they have the votes on the Supreme Court to overturn this. So we're saying that Minnesota should codify this right at the state level before that becomes an issue. There's also a mask ban for law enforcement. There are exceptions for things like being undercover or weather or illness, pandemic, things like that. But it says that law enforcement need to identify themselves. They need to show who they need to show their faces. They need to show their name. They need to show what agency they're with. And this applies uniformly to, again, local, county, state, and federal officers. And that we should know who's, acting as we do in our streets. And this is a long-standing policy of the FBI, and as they've seen around the country, there were people pretending to be law enforcement officers, bounty hunters pretending to be law enforcement officers, and just rogue law enforcement in our streets and streets around the country. Final piece is that 1983 civil cause of action. 1983 refers to a federal statute, so this would be a state level one. These constitutional protections stem out of the federal law for violations of constitutional rights. And they're often strengthened as a result of the KKK's actions in the South and in the civil rights era. And what these do is that they allow individuals whose constitutional rights have been violated to sue local and state officials for those violations of constitutional rights. But what the federal government did was they exempted federal agents and federal agencies from those lawsuits. And so what we'd like to do here is say that there's a state level right to sue any level of government for any violation of the constitutional right. And so there's a nuance there because you can sue for physical harms. You can, if you're roughed up, if you have your arm broken, when you're wrongfully detained, you can sue for the broken arm. You can sue for the physical damage, but you can't sue for that Fourth Amendment violation. And so for the Tincher and Nome plaintiffs, they all have potential federal tort claims acts for those violations, for any harms, the physical harms that they suffered. But there's no guarantee and no remedy for them for any constitutional violations, which the court detailed in their findings that all of them suffered. Policies that we talked about at the Capitol this past year that did not ultimately receive floor votes in either chamber is the STAR Act, and this is part of the North Star Alliance. This is a piece of the bill. Pieces that we talked about earlier were also part of this larger bill, but the main STAR Act piece is that we prohibit cooperation between local, county, and state governments with immigration enforcement. That's mostly just a data sharing and data collection angle. So if school districts, if healthcare facilities, if any of those government service providers, if your local vehicle services, if anybody learns your immigration status, that they don't need to share that and they shouldn't share that with the federal government, that the state and local governments should not be out there doing immigration enforcement. It's not their role. And it's not something that Minnesotans want them out there doing. So that's what that STAR Act does. There's a 287G ban and an ICSA ban, and ICSA is an intergovernmental service agreement. It was a little long, so I left the acronym in there. These are agreements by which the federal government deputizes local and county and state level law enforcement to enforce immigration law. And it essentially makes any local government and local law enforcement a branch of ICE. They can go out there and they can make detentions and they can make arrests on behalf of ICE. And then the Trump administration, Trump 2, has taken huge pains and taken a lot of the money from that One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and they've spread this around and tried to get people signed up. So states like Florida and states like Texas, every single law enforcement agency participates in that. I think we have about a dozen in Minnesota right now, mostly in outstate areas, but we'd like to prohibit those. We don't think they work. We don't think local government should be focusing on immigration enforcement. And what we're seeing around the country is that this, putting local law enforcement in the streets to do immigration enforcement is not making the federal law enforcement and the federal immigration enforcement any safer. It's not making it any better. It's just making our local law enforcement worse. It's making them more violent. It's bringing back in racial profiling. It's doing all of the things that we've tried to eliminate in local law enforcement. It's really breaking the bonds that those law enforcement agencies have tried to build with their communities. There are additional statutory provisions allowing for the arrest authority by federal immigration officers that were granted for some reason in the early 1980s in our state statutes that we're asking them to eliminate. Implementing regulations on bounty hunters, which we don't have at the state level, and then our overall surveillance reform that we think ties in, and we see tying into this immigration work. These license plate readers, reverse warrants, these geolocation searches, these purchasing from data brokers, all of this stuff that feeds into this federal government surveillance apparatus was finally turned and weaponized on our state, and it was weaponized on our immigrant populations. And we need to figure out how the state can be less of a participant, state and local governments be less of a participant in this surveillance web, and protecting Minnesotans from targeted harassment by their government.
Thanks, John. That's a great segue. Talking about the connections between surveillance and immigration enforcement. And really, there's connections between surveillance and really any issue that you can think of, especially racial justice, if you're interested in that, and civil rights. So we see that surveillance is at the intersection of a lot of, social ills, which makes it a great issue for the ACLU to work on, and has been, historically relevant as digital technologies advance. So what we're focused on in the ACLU of Minnesota is facial recognition, reverse warrants, and license plate readers. That doesn't mean we don't weigh in on other topics on surveillance. Really, we weigh in on anything civil rights related when it comes to the legislative session. But these are the bills that we feel that like ACLU should lead and that we've identified as gaps and real weaknesses within the law. And kind of, the whole surveillance infrastructure is bad, but these are good ways of explaining to lawmakers how these technologies work to violate people's individual rights. So we're going to talk about these surveillance reforms in particular, and just in general how surveillance reform is vital for First and Fourth Amendment rights in particular. So facial recognition has been a goal of ours for quite some time. I think since I've came on to the ACLU in 2020, we've highlighted a facial recognition bill and kind of carried it through the years. So I mean, facial recognition is something we've glommed onto as a key issue. One, because it's in the popular imagination. People do tend to know what facial recognition is. It's been in the culture for a long time, and yet it's really unregulated by the state, for something that is such a new and powerful technology. It's really shocking that there is no state regulation of it, especially when we have law enforcement using it. And as we've seen in Operation Metro Surge, we also have ICE and Border Patrol using it, when they take those facial scans without your consent if you happen to be near them. So obviously, facial recognition is just a computer program that analyzes the images and faces of people for the purposes of identifying them. They can be used on public cameras, but really at this point, they can be used on any camera and are kind of supercharged and superpowered by AI. So we see the ACLU sees facial recognition, especially unregulated in this way, as kind of just general warrantless surveillance. The fact that you can be identified, perhaps even tracked, and targeted by the government simply by being out in public, we see as a violation of your rights. And it doesn't help that facial recognition is essentially, unregulated and really being sold by all these individual vendors who promise all kinds of things like that there's a low percentage error rate, that this is, it's tested. And a lot of facial recognition technologies aren't independently tested, but there's always a sales pitch by the vendor who's pitching this technology, usually to a police department or, some other kind of public entity, and kind of selling the technology and saying that, there's really no issues. But what we've seen is that there are huge error rates by race, by gender, by age, really anyone that the computer can't read easily, which is most people. And obviously, the more facial recognition is used, the more you can be identified identified in public and that your movements can be tracked, and that you're just far more vulnerable to the government and any kind of abuse by the government. So we have a bill right now on facial recognition that's trying to regulate it in the same way that drones have been regulated in our state statutes to say that, this is the authorized uses for facial recognition. These are the limitations on use. These are the data retention policies. Right now, it is completely unregulated, which means no guardrails, no protections. So we are essentially trying to get some regulation of that in the state, hopefully in the next session or in the next few sessions. Our other surveillance issue is reverse warrants. This one is probably not in the popular imagination the way that facial recognition is, but it's a really burgeoning issue and it's happening nationwide. So reverse warrants, really you have to think about what a warrant is, and a warrant really is something that should be narrow and specific, doing something that's targeted and not some kind of like blanket thing. So reverse warrants are really the exact opposites of this. They're often warrants issued by a judge, and what they do is that they track your location. So they can do a geofence warrant, for example, is all about location data, and then you'll have the keyword search warrants, which is searching what you typed into a Google engine search, for example, and kind of looking and reverse engineering what you looked up. So there's both location and keyword reverse warrants. And obviously, this is tracking your literal movements, where you have been, what block you have been on, like what streets you're walking down on, and what you're searching online. So we see this as hugely invasive. And oftentimes, what we've seen reported is that police will use this as a kind of a desperate way to get leads. Police will often have no suspects and kind of no real way to issue a targeted warrant. So they'll ask the judge for a reverse warrant to say that we think the suspect might be in this general area. Can we get this warrant to look up location data through cell phone towers? There have been a lot of reports recent years about reverse warrant usage in Minnesota and kind of cities around Minnesota. There was one case where there was a hit and run. This kind of local doctor was killed in a hit and run, and the police really had no leads. They couldn't find the guy. The suspect was on the run. So they used a reverse warrant, and this time they used a keyword search warrant. So they looked up everyone who typed in hit and run on Google. And obviously that was inefficient. They did not catch the killer till this day. No one knows who killed that doctor. So it's an example of, the invasive, violations of privacy that a reverse warrant does, and kind of the like minimal outcomes and kind of the inefficiency of this tool, which is unregulated as well, similar to facial recognition. So we have a bill that would essentially prohibit and ban the usage of it completely. So our next one is license plate readers, and John will talk about this, what it is and why they're important.
Yeah, so you've probably seen or heard some news discussion if you're here on the ACLU's legislative update of license plate readers, these ALPRs, either through Flock or through Axon. Those are the two main companies in the space, but there's an underlying problem more with the technology than with the companies themselves. So you have our millions at this point of license plate readers around the country in law enforcement and local government hands, and an untold amount in private use by large corporations, repossession companies, and generally anyone who just wants to pull one out there. So these are, as I said, they capture basically the license plate of every single individual that drives past. And it stores those for, according to Minnesota law, up to 60 days. And that results in essentially millions of hits and millions of targets on Minnesota license plates each month. And this then opens up to the way Flock works is that, if city contracts with Flock, keeps all of their data stored on Flock servers, and that any other law enforcement agency that contracts with Flock has access to that database unless the local government tells them no. And so what we found through data requests and through conversations with our local police is that a lot of them didn't know that they were supposed to be doing that back end management. And they just assumed that every other law enforcement agency around the country was abiding by Minnesota data laws. They were doing valid searches. They had a lawful purpose. They were related to an active criminal investigation. But they're functionally just not doing any checking. So some law enforcement agencies, one that we found in the Metro during Metro Surge, had about 300,000 searches run against their cameras in a month. There's functionally no way that that law enforcement agency is ensuring that each of those 300,000 searches is related to an active criminal investigation as required by state law. And what we've seen is massive abuse of these cameras around the country. We haven't seen much in Minnesota, but that's mostly because we haven't looked. So there's no guarantee that it's not there. There's just the real guarantee is that nobody's really been looking at them. But we've seen out-of-state agencies do immigration enforcement in Minnesota. We've seen local Minnesota agencies doing immigration enforcement around the state. Around the country, we've seen police departments harassing ex-girlfriends. We've seen internal affairs people who are investigating misuse commit misuse themselves. We've seen them tracking women who are seeking reproductive care. We've seen them used for a variety of other illegal and unconstitutional searches around the country. And like we said, we just don't know the full extent here because we're not privy to that data. So the way Minnesota does it is they classify most of that data as private investigative data. So there's no way for us to confirm that out-of-state agency X down in Florida that has a 287G agreement is actually looking for a criminal when they type in a case number. We don't have access to that information. And so we're asking for stricter regulations on those. Thankfully, our state law does prohibit some of the more advanced uses of this camera. These cameras, the way they're talking about doing it now is to, in addition to flagging the license plates, you can search for a description. So you could search for a white male wearing a blue collared shirt. You could search for a Hispanic male, bald, sorry, Julio, with a pullover. And you could, these cameras can flag that. You could search by facial tattoos. You can search things like that. You can also start bringing them up so that they can ping any device that has a GPS locator. So your phone, an AirTag, the car itself. And it can tell you what vehicle or what device passed by. And then it's a simple hop, skip, and a jump to see who owns that device and where they were traveling. And so not only are we concerned about abuse now, we're concerned about abuse in the future, as a lot of these companies are promising law enforcement and promising their investors that they're going to be able to build out algorithmic mapping of where individuals go and how they travel around the country. Down at both at the broad level, to say here's how many people would drive past your advertisement any given day, but also to say here's where Munira goes, on her weekly path. Here's how often she goes to the grocery store. Here's how often she goes to the office, et cetera, et cetera. And so we'd like to be ahead of that, and that's where state law hasn't really been on these, as we've been behind the ball.
Awesome. So we have an idea of, what is our legislative agenda? What did we go into the session working on? What are our issues? So now we're going to talk about what happened at the end of the legislative session, what some of the outcomes were, and keeping in mind that, we have a tied House with a 1-seat Senate majority. So it was highly unlikely that this was going to be a session in which a lot of bills were passed. Really, it was stalemate and kind of, contentious one at that. But we're going to talk about some of these issues. So the first is the ICE omnibus package passing the Senate, having a House vote and kind of unanimous DFL support in both bodies. And when we say ICE omnibus, we talk about that first section of bills that John discussed, things like the mask ban, the protected spaces, all being put together in one kind of big package with the Senate passing that first and then throwing it to the House. We were really worried that this wouldn't happen and that we wouldn't actually have lawmakers on the record for something that we see as kind of indicative of Operation Metro Surge. We went into this session, and I think a lot of people in session wanted a response to Operation Metro Surge, and they wanted lawmakers on the record on these issues. So we thought that the ICE omnibus represented that, and that it was successful that in a session that was so gridlocked that they could even make that vote with that one seat Senate majority. We also had the all our surveillance bills, those ones that I listed earlier, they all got hearings, which was quite surprising. Usually it's really hard to have both senators and representatives take, surveillance issues, data privacy issues, and kind of, run with those so early in the session and kind of take those seriously. But because of the connections with ICE, with Border Patrol, surveillance was top of mind along with immigration enforcement. So we had our reverse warrant bill made it the farthest I think any reverse warrant bill in the nation has, and it went to conference committee, which is that last stop right before passage, which requires that the House and the Senate work things out and kind of align their bills, and that's when it died. But this is incredibly positive because we have lawmakers bought in on the idea. We've been able to talk about it. We've been on the record with testimony, and we can come back stronger next year and pass that ban, hopefully. We also, towards the end of the legislative session, had a lot of defensive work, actually. Once a lot of these bills died, especially with the tied House, especially the immigration bills, there were smaller issues that weren't getting a lot of limelight, but ACLU still saw as something to protect against and make sure that they don't pass into law. So, there was a law enforcement data protection bill that did pass that has to do with law enforcement doxing and extra penalties on that. We just saw that this was not a priority, seeing as law enforcement weren't the ones that were being attacked during Operation Metro Surge. And that maybe that this bill has a lot of government transparency issues as well. But that was, a bipartisan bill to protect law enforcement, and that did pass, though we were on the record opposing it. There was also a lot of bills around social media and minors and social media content. There was one bill that luckily did not pass and that we did oppose, which was the social media age verification. And these have popped up across the country. There's a lot of effort to kind of regulate what kids see online, what minors see, the content that they see, how they engage with social media as well. So there's, these bills to verify age, but, they nationally, they've been linked to a lot of like anti-LGBTQ, right-wing supporters, right-wing orgs pushing these bills, trying to get age verification passed. One, it's kind of just troubling that you should have to identify yourself just to use the internet. We see that as a problem, but then also there's a lot of content censorship, especially when it comes to sexual health. So we're really looking out for these bills that, claim to protect children, but really just, encourage censorship and like First Amendment violations. And kids still have First Amendment rights. We also saw a lot of school surveillance bills that we had to oppose, especially adding school surveillance technology into the schools as a way of protecting children. Obviously, there's been a lot of violence in schools with mass shootings, and we see lawmakers trying to really reach for the easy solution of surveillance technology and kind of just, buying some technology and using it in the school as a way to say that, well, we've protected children now. And obviously, this has a lot of privacy implications, but also the technology is just horribly unreliable and, relies on surveillance tech. But John, do you want to add more about the end of the legislative session and what we saw with the bills passed and the defensive work and all that?
Yeah, I think there was good coverage of that. We were there till the very end. There's always a chance with the late term and the end of session negotiations that things have passed off. Either house can either pass things you like, things you don't like. So it's a lot of work there to be tracking things and be in communication with those legislators to make sure that they know our position remains the same. The ICE omnibus was a great success. It was a tremendous effort by the Senate to get it corralled, get it into the order they liked, and to get it over the floor. and great unanimity in that caucus to move it along. It did do a good job of previewing for us where the attacks are going to come in future sessions. Say the cost of immigrant children in public schools with and things like that. So it's helpful to know. The House had a less robust debate because they brought it up at the very end to try to get it across the line. But we're grateful that we have people on the record. We know where they stand. And it did have, I mentioned earlier, that had unanimous DFL support, which was good. It did not have unanimous GOP opposition, but it did not have sufficient support to pass. There were 4 GOP legislators, all of whom were in swing districts, who stayed off the board on that vote. So it failed on a 67-63. You do need 68, which is a majority to pass. So they knew it wouldn't pass, and they did take the quiet way out, but it showed that the energy that was there to the energy wasn't there to take that hardline immigration stance that they had taken in 2025. And what we really saw was a full reversal from the parties on who was afraid of immigration politics, and who wanted to be loud, who wanted to make it a centerpiece of their agenda. And a lot of that was not necessarily it was proactive, it was following how Minnesotans responded. And we're not happy that it took Metro Surge, but the community outpouring and the community support and the community togetherness really showed Minnesota legislators exactly where the Minnesota public stood on our immigrant neighbors, and that they're here, they're welcome here, and they're always going to be welcome here. And if we're going to put our bodies on the line, that they should be at least willing to put their votes on the line. And so we're optimistic that that's how it ended. We're mad obviously that we came a vote short, but we're optimistic that the public sentiment around immigration politics has shifted, and we do think that's no shift is permanent, but we do think that shift will be longer lasting than most.
Wonderful. So we want to highlight some things about the legislature and the fact that it's an election year. And I mentioned that this was going to be a tough session going into it. So we're going to talk about why it is a tough session, and where we are in the timeline of the election and really a new entire legislature being elected. So that means new faces, new people, new politics, new dynamics. So in 2026, we saw that, this is the second year of the biennium. It's a shorter session. Again, they have that gridlock with the tied house, and there's no need for a budget to pass. So that means there's no need to negotiate, and really they're under no compulsion to even pass, a single bill. We also see that Governor Walz is not seeking re-election, which opens up, the field, especially for like someone like Klobuchar to run. And then we see Speaker Damith running with a contested GOP primary, which really, I think, affected maybe the decision making within the party on the Republican side. So that's the context that we're working with in an election year. So all these lawmakers are going to go off and campaign. And this is the situation in which they're, having the legislative session. And in the next year, we see that we'll have an entirely new legislature post-election. And we do believe that the House tie is unlikely to continue, and that a Democratic trifecta with a Democratic governor is very possible, which means, a completely new dynamic, which means that we bring new issues to the table. It doesn't mean that, it's entirely positive. ACLU often has a lot of issues with Democrats as we do Republicans. And I think maybe that's not appreciated. We are not a partisan org. We will work with any party to pass ACLU issues. And that we see that every makeup of the legislative session, whether it's like fully GOP control, fully DFL control, it has its own opportunities and challenges. But we're looking at a completely new situation next year, is what we're trying to say. John, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that covered it. We have there's going to be a lot of turnover, new governor, new lieutenant governor, and I think we're up to 40 or 50 new legislators out of about 200. So there'll be quite the shakeup.
Agreed. So we're good. This is the last slide. Thank you for sitting through all that. I hope you found it informational, and we'll talk into the Q&A next. But we're going to talk about next steps, what we'll be doing basically since the next legislative session in this interim. We are going to have a focus on surveillance policy. And since ACLU leads in this issue area, we thought it'd be wonderful to start a surveillance state policy table, which is kind of like a coalition, but kind of a looser, coalition and kind of a group that we don't have to move in unison, but we can at least work together on issues that we care about, like surveillance reform, and really increase capacity at the state legislative session. You know, the more partners you have on an issue, the more lawmakers hear from different organizations, the better it is. So we're going to focus on surveillance, make it a campaign, have a campaign launch, and have a policy table at the state level where we can advocate on surveillance issues. We're also going to have a really fun event, which we will plug more at the state fair. But we're going to do a movie screening on Minority Report. This was something that was cooked up within our internal teams, and we thought would be a great way of engaging the public and talking about the importance of surveillance and data privacy with what is, a very fun, nostalgic movie that pretty much everyone remembers. So we'll have that movie screening September 21st, and there'll be more details from us coming out to everybody. And then, of course, post-election, the policy team will be making sure to talk to all our new lawmakers and start lobbying and start getting to, make sure that ACLU issues are elevated and that we win on these issues and reforms for the next legislative session in 2027. And we also want to remind you that the legislative session, which has all this information, including links to bills, and has that kind of full debrief, is live on our website, and that you can go and Google and look for it and read through everything that's happened this session. So now we'll move into Q&A, and I've stopped sharing.
So I think I can just pull from the Q&A, and if people have other questions, they can feel free to put them in there. Maeve asked, were any of these legislative priorities things the ACLU Minnesota has worked on with other state ACLU groups on in the past or hope to in the future? Yeah, so there are state affiliates, and some states have multiple. DC and New York have their own. In New York City has their own. So I think there are about 57 state chapters and the national affiliate as well. So things like that's way too big. Things like our 1983 work, our work on Flock, a lot of these are being supported by other states. We'll be working with, Massachusetts, Washington, and a few others on surveillance guidance. What we're looking for in smart surveillance policy, and then a lot of the immigration work, the 287G bans. We're hoping to build on what other states like Virginia and New Mexico, joining like New York, California, Illinois, as states that have banned those. And so there's a lot of good groundwork that has been laid by our other state affiliates that we hope to build on there. And then the anonymous attendee asks, how do the ALPR devices track individuals and their license data? It does not connect to publicly available license registries. I'm not really aware of any, but law enforcement generally has data sharing agreements with each other, utilizing the Motor Vehicle Services database. So if they're looking for a plate that the ALPR tracks, so Flock won't necessarily know who the car is owned by, but law enforcement generally has access to those through like law enforcement, is it LEMS? It's one of them. And I can't remember what the other data sharing agreements are, but there are programs that they can run registrations through. We also have an anonymous ask on, do you expect lawmakers to maintain their focus on immigration and these related issues during next session? What is their sustained level of commitment? We're hoping they will. We've had good commitments from the legislators that they're going to continue to work from them. There was a lot of frustration that nothing could be done in response to Metro Surge last year. So I don't think that the energy has faded or dissipated. There are plenty of legislators who continue to talk about it in their candidate roles. Now that they're out on the campaign trail. And so we are optimistic. The public outrage remains high. The public engagement remains pressing. And for the simple fact that the federal government is not going to change hands, the Trump administration will still be the Trump administration for the next 2 years. And so we don't expect immigration to become a less salient issue at the national level.
Yeah, I would also add, John, maybe Julio can talk about IDN. And the fact that IDN is a network of organizations that are going to be talking to lawmakers and also making sure to lobby them and make sure that they don't forget about this issue. Julio, do you want to talk more about IDN involving this new legislature?
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of our partners. This is one of the big things they're going to be talking about this session. As the observer programs continue, as there's threats to the polls with deployment of ICE and federal agents. This is going to be an issue that's going to be permeated. It's going to be talked about in all kinds of spaces. The IDN is 90 orgs, 90 organizations that are immigrant adjacent, working towards this. Even within that, there's other groups like the North Star Alliance, which is another group of organizations that work towards passing the North Star Act or Star Act. Those organizations are committed to be talking about this. I think it's really up to us to be pushed to keep bringing this up. In addition to this, on the ground we have 287Gs, and John, you were talking about this a little bit more. We have a lot of communities like Brainerd in Crow Wing, Candy, Ojai, who have been speaking directly to their local officials about how immigration is trying to court local law enforcement into becoming part of ICE. That's the next wave of this, right? We know that ICE, even as inflated as their budget, even as they ask for more and for more. For more funding. They want to establish a culture of local law enforcement as immigrant agents, and so that's something we're going to stop. We're going to be working at a local level to be and talking to individuals, talking to folks, to talk to their local sheriffs, talk to their police chiefs, to their CLEOs, to be able to bring up this issue to make sure that's not something. So it's going to be happening at the county commissioner meeting. It's going to happen at the city council meetings, and it's going to be happening at the state. So this is something that's not going away, and it's up to us to keep pressure on.
Thanks, Julio. The anonymous asks about an issue might bring on a JFL trifecta that we didn't talk about tonight. We do have other carceral reform work. So we're part of an End Slavery Coalition, which works on requiring minimum wage for incarcerated workers. We're also part of a pretrial coalition, which is seeking to end cash bail requirements. These were issues that were brought in past sessions that we've continued to work on. The likelihood of success for those was very low in mixed government, and so they'll become a bit more of a forefront this year or next year. But I don't think we have new policies. It's just which policies have had the best chance of success. We've tried to ensure that we do bring forth our bill so the issues are there for discussion and for future campaign work or public relations or communications work. But I don't know of any new issues that haven't been brought forward that we're considering. But there may be some, so I'll let Minir and Julio think on that. ICE at the airports, we don't have any information on that, if national or our organizations. Considering that, I did see the reporting on it today. But there's a lot of what ICE and CBP and DHS can do to stop someone at an airport or in those locations. I'm not saying outright that it's constitutional, but if they are flagging names and associating them with lapsed visas or things like that, I don't know. I just don't know what the national org is planning in that space. But I'm sure it's something that legal orgs will be taking a look at. And then finally, to the last question, people get involved in building. I think Julio touched on that a bit. If you have anything more to add, Julio, or Noble, if you have communications related angles for people to be considering, I think that would be a really nice question to close out on, to bring that energy towards next session.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. Listen, I think you all heard from Nira specifically talk about this next upcoming table for surveillance. That's going to be one of the biggest issues that we're going to see, both as technology grows and as the type of enforcement that's going to be utilized and deployed. So you saw September 21st, right, at the we're going to be having a screening. That's going to be the first of many of these events that are going to be kickoff for that campaign. Locally, I talked a little bit about this. We have a 287G anti-287G campaign that's live. We are working with many communities across Minnesota to capacitate to build power within these communities, to build capacity, to talk to your local officials. Our volunteers have worked from the local from working with sheriffs locally to coming up to the state and even to Congress. Right, this is something that's going to be all aspects of our government. That's something we want to get involved in. You're going to get a follow-up email today with more of these, with actually the report that this has on both events. If you've registered for this event or for this webinar, and if you're here, you'll be automatically getting updates. So make sure like you don't unsubscribe or don't bring it or keep getting our information. That means you're part of our volunteer network. That means you'll get updates on what we're doing, especially as it pertains to our campaigns on both immigration and surveillance. If those are things that you're interested in, things that you're seeing in your community, then we ask you to stay tuned with us as we continue this, as we push things to the legislature, as we push things in your hometowns. So please stick with us. You'll get more updates, get more information, and as things develop, we'd really like to connect with you.
Is there any more questions, Sean, or is that it?
That's all I see in the chat.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'll close this out. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This was really wonderful. It was nice to go back and think about what happened last year into this and what the outcomes were. So we're happy to share that. And like Julio said, we'll be able to send all these resources via email later on. But thank you for joining us. And I guess till next time. See you.